I knew things would go well in this seminar when I saw this graphic, because I think it's a perfect visual image of the overworked woman trying to juggle many different tasks. I'm not quite sure what the name of this goddess is, but I really like her. I just want to warn you that even though I titled my talk Feminist Economics in Care, there are a lot of different versions of feminist economics, and I do not speak for the, end all, be all, everyone agrees view of things. It's really kind of my personal take on the subject, and really happy to have you as an audience, because I really think it's really important for academics and activists to have more of a dialogue about all these issues. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have been teaching economics for about 35 years at the University of Massachusetts, but I'm also kind of a wannabe artist. I kind of came from the direction of Marxist political economy and quickly got interested in feminist theory as a way of connecting class and gender and race and other issues. And I've always had a bit of an activist bent. I was first arrested in a demonstration in 1969, which makes me kind of a veteran. And I worked for many years with a group called the Center for Popular Economics, teaching, basically organizing week-long courses in economics for activists, and just trying to kind of go over the basic economics vocabulary and make people feel better positioned to argue with experts who often don't have our best interests at heart. So I have a fair number of academic writing out there, but I also have a blog. It's called Care Talk, and I put the URL there. And it's a good place to visit if you're interested in following up on some of these ideas. And you can also comment on the blog posts. So it's kind of the way I try to stay connected with people that I'm presenting to. Okay, so I'm going to answer 3 questions, or try to at least throw out answers. What do we mean when we talk about the economy? It turns out that's a little more complicated than you might initially think. Then what is care work, and why does it matter? Why should you care about it? And also, why should you care about intersectionality, and what does that mean? I think it's a word that has maybe gotten more currency in the US than elsewhere, but I think it's actually one of the more useful byproducts of our particular constellation of political forces in the US. So I think it will be of interest to you. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this poster before. It's like one of my favorite political posters. It was the See Red Women's Collective in London in the 70s that produced it. And what they're trying to do, I think, is pretty clear from the image, to show that the factory, which is in the background, is not the only place that work takes place. That capitalism also really depends on domestic labor, the process of keeping us all going and making it possible for us to get up in the morning and go to work. Just a couple of things about this poster that I'm less satisfied with than I once was when I first discovered it many years ago. One problem with it is that it seems to be focusing on the daily reproduction of the worker, and there are no children in it, and there are no elderly people in it. All the workers are white. There's not much difference between them, and you'll see later that's kind of where intersectionality comes into the story. Another thing about it is that it's not just capitalism that depends on domestic labor. Every economic system, including any future socialist system, will depend on domestic labor. So I don't think we can't really analyze it using only the vocabulary of a critique of capitalism. It has to have, we have to give it some independent consideration and see it as something that's separate and distinct from capitalism as a system. So what do we mean when we use the word labor or work? And sometimes people think of it as, you know, producing a thing, a material thing, a car, an air conditioner. Sometimes people think of it as something that you have to be paid to do, that something that you only do because you have to do it, because you don't really have a choice. But the definition that is used in a lot of the research on unpaid work and on time use is a little bit different. It's something that you could, in principle, pay someone else to do for you, or sometimes it's described as activities that contribute positively to social provisioning, even though they are not paid. So what that means is that work can be paid or unpaid, and we need to look at both dimensions of it and think about how they interconnect. So a lot of economics textbooks start out with a description of what's called the circular flow. And it's usually focused entirely on money, on the way how money flows from households to businesses, and back to households and to government, and then back from government to businesses. So households are supplying labor, businesses are paying a wage for that labor, households are using that money to buy stuff from businesses, and government is helping the process along by making transfers and providing public services. But if you really look at the economy as a whole, and I'm going to give you some numbers that really illustrate this point. But for now, I just want you to think about it visually. Those red arrows are describing the flow of money, things that are denominated in money. And there are other things that are just not denominated in money at all. And one of the most important things are interactions with the physical environment and the climate. Economists usually call those externalities because they're external to the boxes. And here you see the blue arrows, two-way arrows between the little boxes and the ocean that is, you know, the air and the climate, everything that is sort of outside of our own institutional control. And of course, we rely really heavily on extracting resources from that environment. And we also, unfortunately, dump a lot of garbage back into that environment. And that should be seen as part of the economy. But then the real focus of my talk is what goes on in households, and looking inside of households and recognizing that there's a lot of money that changes hands in households, and also a lot of time. There are exchanges between men and women, between men and other men, between women and other women, between parents and children, between children and parents. And those flows actually add up to a pretty significant share of the economy as a whole. And we really have to understand what's going on inside of those households to understand the bigger picture. So I often make this point using data from the US, but I managed to find some pretty recent data for Scotland from the Office of National Statistics, UK Office of National Statistics. And I think it's really pretty striking to see that in this year, the time use survey that was implemented by the Office of National Statistics showed that the average minutes per day spent on unpaid work was way higher than the average minutes per day spent on paid work. It's a very surprising difference, but it's largely related to the fact that a pretty large percentage of the Scottish population is either in school, therefore not working for pay, or is retired and not working for pay. So what the ONS reports is that in Scotland on a given day, and this includes the weekends, it's an average for any given day, only about 35% of the population is engaging in paid work. And this unpaid work, I'm going to refer to as a form of direct or indirect care work. That is, it's mostly work that involves looking after other people, many of them dependents, not all of them. Sometimes direct care work, I mean something like feeding a child, reading aloud to a child, um, putting a child to bed, bathing a child, but there's also indirect care work, preparing meals, keeping the house clean, going shopping, errands like that. And here's at the bottom of the page, you see the URL to the time use survey results if you want to look at them in more detail. So there's some good things and some bad things, actually, or some mixed things about the importance of unpaid work. One thing that I think is encouraging for activists is that it really shows that the invisible heart is even more important than the invisible hand, which is the phrase that a famous Scot, Adam Smith, used to describe the market economy. So, it's not markets that are allocating unpaid work. It's basically moral obligations, social commitments, personal attachments that are basically kind of organizing this process of unpaid work. But specialization in care work or unpaid work has a downside, and the downside is that it's economically risky. It's risky for women because a lot of women specialize in care provision, but it's also risky for men if they engage in care provision. So here's some data from Scotland, which is very typical of other affluent countries, including the US, a little bit different, but very, very similar. Women devote about 90 minutes per day more to unpaid work than men do. And men devote more time to paid work, about 71 minutes per day more to paid work. So as you can tell by comparing those numbers, women are working slightly longer hours per day than men if you take both paid and unpaid work into consideration. But an even more important factor is that women tend to put unpaid care responsibilities first. So they prioritize them, often at the cost of their own individual earnings. And nothing has made that more apparent than the pandemic, where the job losses have been particularly great among women, and a lot of women have dropped out of the labor force because of the responsibilities of family care, and that's involved an increase in their unpaid care workload in addition to it. And this is really just a kind of amplified version of what was happening and is before the pandemic and will continue to happen after the pandemic, which is that by taking this responsibility for unpaid care, women are lowering their lifetime earnings. They're left vulnerable to separation, divorce, to single parenthood, to poverty and old age. And this gender inequality is exacerbated by the fact that women also tend to enter jobs in health, education, and social services that most of which entail care provision, and most of which aren't paid as well as comparable jobs that require comparable levels of education. So I can't speak for the Scottish case, but in the US, single women who are not married and who don't have kids basically earn the same as men who are in the same situation, that is, not married and don't have kids. So a lot of gender inequality in the US in particular arises from differences in family commitments, not just differences that are attributable to discrimination in the workplace, although discrimination in the workplace also clearly plays a really, really important role. So why is it that care work is productive? That is, it's labor, it's important, we need it, we rely on it, but it's disempowering. That is, you don't get really economically rewarded for doing it. Well, one reason is that care work is not really producing things. It's producing or developing or maintaining human capabilities. It's often a response to need rather than market demand. And it's often really infused with emotional connection and moral commitment. And it makes it very hard to bargain. You can't tell your child, you know, if you don't do this, you're on the street. Um, you don't tell your client, if you're a nurse and you don't like what how a patient is treating you, you don't say, well, to the patient, well, go take care of yourself then. The very nature of the work requires some, um, you know, some empathy, and empathy itself has some costly implications for people. I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished, but especially in a very competitive market-based economy where everybody's trying to elbow everybody else out of the way, a lot of the time, people that tuck their elbows in and try to hug people um, are often penalized, and that has some consequences for their political power and their cultural voice. Another thing about care work that's really important to remember is it involves teamwork. You can't really identify what your individual value added is, you know? Parents can't take credit for what their children do or don't do because it's partly related to the children themselves, how, you know, how they are, how effectively they uh, are able to deal with the world, what their schools are like, what kinds of a community they live in, you know? An individual teacher, you know, their impact on a student depends on partly on the student, partly on the other teachers, partly on the parents. You can't really, it's not like a piecework assembly line where you can say, oh, teacher X produced product Y. But probably the most important reason that care work is disempowering, in my opinion, is it's really hard to capture the full value that's created. And in this sense, care work is like, resembles the externalities that environmental economists emphasize, things that fall outside the market economy. In this case, it's a positive externality. That is the process of taking good care of people, raising good, you know, raising children to be productive and happy adults, taking care of community members. That's not something that is measured or captured in dollar terms, but it's something that we all benefit from in some very intangible and difficult to measure, but really, really indispensable ways. And that's where the public sector comes in. That's where nonprofits come in as an effort to support and nourish the production of those human capabilities and abilities. But unfortunately, the public sector, like the women providing care, is often treated as though it's unproductive, unimportant, doesn't really need to be rewarded, is not really related to economic growth or development, and can kind of safely be ignored or minimized or downplayed. So that brings me to a discussion of intersecting inequalities and the concept of intersectionality, which I think is really, really necessary to understand the complexity of the hierarchies that we inhabit. You know, I came out of a tradition that looked at class conflict, but I always saw differences between men and women of the same class. In the US in particular, differences based on race and ethnicity are often cross-cutting differences based on gender and class. And I think that the result of that is, instead of thinking about one pyramid of inequality based just on ownership of wealth, we need to think about a lot of other pyramids of inequality, as the graphic indicates, that are based on things like, you know, inequality and responsibility for taking care of dependents, inequality in access to education, inequality in access to living in good communities. And a lot of inequalities that have to do with the costs of producing and maintaining human capabilities that are part of our, you know, are a really important part of our commonwealth. So another way to summarize this point is just to say that many of us are winners in some ways and losers in others. So we may live in a country where we're kind of near the bottom of the income distribution, but if it's a rich country, our standard of living and our opportunities are much more expansive than are those of others living in relatively poor countries. And yes, there are some people that are just winners all the way, and there are some people for whom oppression and exploitation are compounded layer upon layer. but a lot of us are in somewhat contradictory positions, and that's what makes alliances and coalitions so important to current political the current political environment. So, you know, for a long time, I had a poster in my office that said, class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on. Class analysis is figuring out who is there with you. And I think if we broaden the meaning of class beyond the idea of workers and employers, and think of it as a sort of a metaphor for other dimensions of group inequality, it's still a very, very good guideline for thinking about political strategy. So, sorry, my voice is has gotten a little overused on these endless days of Zoom. Let me just close by talking about this strategic implications, although I'm hoping that you'll really flesh these out and have something to teach me about what you think the implications might be. The first is that we really need to appreciate conflicting interests. I think, well, this is true, especially in the US, where political divisions are really intense and very polarized. And it's really easy to look at other groups and say, well, they just don't understand the world. They just don't get it. Or they've been hoodwinked by the press or something like that. But often instead what's happening is that they're not really sure what group they really want to ally themselves with and where they stand to most to gain. And they're also really unsure of what other people are going to do, which increases the overall uncertainty, which I think sometimes makes them very vulnerable to demagogues that kind of rally and energize them around an agenda that does make, in fact, very false promises. So again, what that leads to is the importance of coalition and alliance based on saying to other groups, look, we do have some differences. We're not the same, but we have a lot to gain in the long run by working together. And I think that this really comes to the fore in dealing with global warming, with climate change, because here you have an example of a problem that we can only solve by building a really, really large coalition and overcoming a lot of internal differences. We need to be aware of those differences in order to overcome them. So improving, expanding democracy has got to be really key. We know a lot more now about how democracy can be perverted and corrupted, and we need to develop better safeguards for it. And we need to expand it beyond political institutions to our economic institutions. We need to share care. We need to realize that the traditional division of labor is putting women at a disadvantage and creating some really serious economic problems, not just for women, but for children and future generations. And overall and above all, we need to develop a really positive and feasible vision of a more caring and a more equitable economy. And I know that's why you're here, to try to develop that. It's a really hard task, but it's really indispensable to our collective future. So I have written a book recently called The Rise and Decline of Patriarchal Systems in Intersectional Political Economy. It's a very academic book, but if you're interested in seeing some more of the theoretical points and issues in the history that I've alluded to, you can find some of it there. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks a lot.